Let me ask you something before we start. Have you ever passed by a huge empty building and wondered how something that big could ever be useless? Because across America, there are buildings so massive, so busy, and so important that entire cities once revolved around them. Not metaphorically, literally. People woke up because of them, ate because of them, raised families because of them. When these buildings were running, the city around them had a pulse. What's crazy is that most of them didn't fail in a dramatic way. They didn't explode. They weren't wiped out overnight. They just stopped being needed. And when that happened, the cities built around them never felt the same again. These weren't just workplaces. They were anchors. One building could decide whether a town grew, survived, or slowly emptied out. When the lights went off inside, everything outside started changing too. Houses, schools, shops, even the mood of the place. In this video, I'm going to walk you through 8 American buildings that once fed entire cities. Not as history lessons, not as cold documentaries, but as real places where real people spent their lives. And as we go through them, one by one, you'll start noticing a pattern. Not about buildings, but about how fragile permanent things really are. Let's start with the first one. Packard Automotive Plant. Imagine living in a neighborhood where your alarm clock didn't matter, because the factory decided your day. When the Packard plant was alive, Detroit didn't just wake up around it, it moved around it. Shift changes flooded the streets. Lunch breaks filled diners. Paydays kept entire blocks running. This wasn't a normal factory. When it opened in the early 1900s, the Packard Automotive Plant became one of the largest industrial buildings on Earth. At its peak, more than 40,000 people worked inside it, not in offices, on loud floors filled with steel, engine, sparks, and heat. Packard cars weren't cheap either. They were luxury. Presidents drove them. Celebrities owned them. Detroit's reputation for quality wasn't built by accident. It was built here. What made this place different wasn't just size, but certainty. If you worked at Packard, you planned your life around it. Mortgages, schools, local shops, even churches assumed the plant would always be there. Generations followed the same path. Father to son, uncle to nephew. The building didn't feel temporary. It felt like part of the city's foundation. Then, the orders slowed. Competition tightened. Management decisions shifted. And instead of one dramatic shutdown, pieces of the plant started going quiet. By the late 1950s, Packard was done. The building stayed. The people didn't. Today, the Packard plant still stands. Broken, open to the sky, stripped of value. 2. Bethlehem Steel Plant. If you stood near the Bethlehem Steel Plant when it was running, you didn't need to see it to know it was alive. You could hear it. The low metal roar never really stopped. Day or night, the sound carried across the river and into the town, a reminder that something massive was constantly being built. For decades, this place didn't just provide jobs, it gave Bethlehem its reason to exist. At its peak, more than 30,000 workers passed through the plant. Steel poured out of here into bridges, railroads, skyscrapers, and warships. Parts of the Golden Gate Bridge, the Chrysler Building, and countless American landmarks were shaped by hands that clocked in at this single site. Working here wasn't glamorous. It was brutal. 12-hour shifts, extreme heat, dangerous conditions. But it paid well, and it paid reliably. A steel job meant you could buy a house, raise kids, and expect your town to keep growing. Local schools, diners, hardware stores, and bars all synced themselves to the plant's schedule. When the night shift ended, the town felt it. What made Bethlehem Steel feel unbreakable was demand. America needed steel, and this place was one of the biggest suppliers in the country. As long as cities grew and wars were fought, Bethlehem felt essential. Nobody talked about alternatives. You didn't replace a giant like this. You built around it. Then, slowly, the world changed its mind. Foreign steel flooded the market. Production costs rose. Modern mills elsewhere produced faster and cheaper. Instead of reinvesting heavily in modernization, Bethlehem Steel struggled to keep up with a system that no longer favored old giants. Layoffs came first, then departments shut down. 3. Pullman Factory Complex. Pullman wasn't just where people worked, it was where they were allowed to live. If you got a job at the Pullman factory in the late 1800s and early 1900s, your employer didn't just make your railroad car. It decided your house, your rent, your church, your grocery store, even the rules you lived under. Pullman was a factory wrapped inside a company town, and thousands of families depended on it in ways that went far beyond a paycheck. The Pullman Company built luxury sleeping cars for America's railroads, and demand was enormous. At its peak, the factory employed tens of thousands of workers, and the surrounding town was designed to keep them close, productive, and dependent. Wages came from Pullman. Housing came from Pullman. If you lost your job, you didn't just lose income, you lost your home. For a long time, the system worked. The town looked clean and orderly. Streets were planned. Buildings were solid. From the outside, Pullman looked like a model of industrial success. But inside, tension grew. Rent stayed high even when wages were cut. Workers had no say in decisions that shaped their daily lives. When demand dropped during an economic downturn, Pullman cut pay but didn't lower rents. Families felt trapped, and in 1894, that pressure exploded into one of the most important labor strikes in American history. Rail traffic across the country was disrupted. The federal government stepped in. The illusion of control collapsed in public view. Eventually, the factory lost its grip. Operations shrank. The company-town model unraveled. Pullman stopped being the center of economic life, and the community around it was forced to separate itself from a system that had once dictated everything. 4. Ford River Rouge Complex. The River Rouge Complex worked like a machine that never needed the outside world. Raw materials arrived by ship and rail, and finished cars left the other end ready to be sold. Steel was made on-site. Glass was produced on-site. Engines, frames, bodies, and final assembly all happened inside the same boundary. Nothing about it was small or flexible. It was designed to run at full force, every day for decades. At its peak, more than 100,000 workers moved through the complex. That number alone shaped southeastern Michigan. Roads, housing, schools, and entire towns existed because Ford needed people close enough to show up every morning. Shift changes dictated traffic. Paydays dictated when stores were busy. Families didn't ask whether the plant would last. They assumed it would, because nothing that large had ever disappeared before. River Rouge represented a specific way of thinking about industry. Control mattered more than speed. If Ford owned every step of production, delays could be absorbed internally. If suppliers failed, Rouge could keep going. During World War II, this approach turned the complex into a national asset, producing vehicles and equipment at a scale that reinforced the idea that bigger systems were safer systems. Over time, that logic stopped working. Global manufacturing shifted towards specialization and outsourcing. Producing everything in one place became expensive to maintain and slow to adjust. Automation reduced the need for massive workforces. Competing plants overseas produced components faster and cheaper without carrying the same overhead. The complex didn't shut down in one move. Operations were reduced piece by piece. Sections were sold off. Entire departments disappeared while others remained active. Employment dropped steadily, not suddenly. The surrounding communities felt the change before it ever made headlines, as fewer workers meant fewer paychecks circulating locally. 5. Willow Run Bomber Plant. Michigan Willow Run existed for one reason, and it did that one thing relentlessly. During World War II, this plant was built to produce bombers, and it did so at a pace that reshaped how Americans understood manufacturing. The building itself stretched for miles. Inside, production lines ran with military precision, and workers moved through the space knowing that delays weren't just financial, they were measured in lives. At its peak, Willow Run employed more than 40,000 people, many of whom had never worked in factories before. Farmers, students, and homemakers were trained quickly and placed into roles that had to function immediately. By 1944, the plant was producing one B-24 bomber every hour, a number that still feels unreal when you picture the complexity of the aircraft. Entire towns around the plant adjusted to shift schedules, transportation needs, and housing shortages caused by the sudden flood of workers. When the war ended, the need vanished just as quickly. Bomber production stopped. Thousands of workers were no longer needed. The building remained, but its original purpose was gone. Willow Run shows a different kind of feeding, not long-term stability, but total absorption. 6. Sears Distribution Center, Ponce City Market. Before Atlanta became a tech and entertainment hub, this building quietly ran the city's everyday life. Long before online shopping or next-day delivery, Sears operated massive distribution centers that fed entire regions, and this one was among the most important in the Southeast. Trains rolled directly into the building. Goods rolled out to stores and homes across multiple states. At its peak, thousands of workers passed through this facility every day. They weren't selling products to customers. They were sorting, packing, shipping, and coordinating the physical movement of American life. Appliances, clothing, tools, furniture, and household essentials moved through this building on tight schedules long before logistics became a buzzword. Entire neighborhoods nearby existed because the warehouse needed people close enough to keep it running around the clock. What made this place powerful wasn't visibility, but dependence. independence. Customers rarely thought about where their orders came from. Store shelves stayed stocked. Deliveries arrived on time. The system felt invisible, which made it feel permanent. For Atlanta, the building meant steady employment, predictable paychecks, and constant rail traffic that supported other industries around it. As retail logistics changed, the role of this building narrowed. Distribution moved toward faster, more flexible networks. Regional hubs were replaced by systems optimized for speed and digital coordination. What had once been a central artery became a bottleneck. Operations slowed. Jobs were reduced. The building stopped feeding the city the way it once had, even though it still stood in the same place. For years, the structure remained underused, too large to ignore and too specific to easily replace. Eventually, it was transformed into something completely different. Today, it's known as Ponce City Market, filled with offices, restaurants, and apartments. The building is alive again, but the kind of life it supports is not the same. 7. Buick City Complex. In Flint, the day used to run on one question: which shift are you on? Buick City wasn't just where people worked. It set the schedule for the entire city. Morning traffic, school timings, lunch crowds. Even when stores stayed open late, all of it followed the rhythm of General Motors shifts. If Buick City was running strong, Flint felt stable. If it slowed, the city felt uneasy. At its peak in the 1970s, the Buick City complex employed tens of thousands of workers and produced hundreds of thousands of vehicles every year. It wasn't a single building, but a massive cluster of plants tied together, designed to keep cars moving from one stage to the next without interruption. Generations of families depended on it. People didn't job hop. You got into GM and expected to stay. The work was repetitive and exhausting, but it paid well enough to support a middle-class life. Houses, local diners, barbershops, schools, and small businesses survived because GM paychecks arrived like clockwork. What changed wasn't one bad year. Manufacturing began moving elsewhere. Automation reduced the need for labor. New plants were built outside the city, then outside the country. Buick City started shrinking in pieces. One line shut down. Another moved. Jobs disappeared slowly enough that people kept waiting for things to turn around. By the early 2000s, the complex was gone. 8. American Can Company Plant. In Gary, movement mattered more than noise. Trucks came in full and left full. Rail cars lined up day and night. The American Can Company plant didn't look dramatic from the outside, but it kept food moving across the country, and that made it essential in a way most people never thought about. This plant produced millions of cans every day, the kind that ended up holding soup, vegetables, meat, and drinks on shelves nationwide. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was constant. As long as Americans were eating packaged food, this place stayed busy. At its peak, thousands of workers depended on the plant, and the city around it depended on those workers. Gary itself had been built around industry, and factories like this one gave it stability even as other sectors fluctuated. The plant didn't just provide jobs inside its walls. It supported trucking companies, rail operations, maintenance crews, local suppliers, and small businesses that relied on a steady flow of workers passing through the area every day. What changed wasn't demand for canned food. It was where and how that food was packaged. Production consolidated into fewer, more automated facilities. Companies optimized for scale and cost, moving operations away from older industrial cities. And when it moved, Gary felt the loss immediately. The plant shut down quietly. There were no national headlines. No sudden shock, just fewer trucks, fewer rail cars, fewer paychecks circulating through the city. Buildings like this don't collapse cities overnight, but when they leave, the recovery is slow because the ecosystem they supported was never meant to stand alone. Drop a comment and share which one surprised you the most. And if you like videos that dig into real places, real stories, and the things America quietly moved on from, make sure to subscribe.